Oliver Burkeman, welcome back to the Freedom Pack podcast, my friend.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Well, I have to say, I've read the book and I absolutely loved it. And I probably broke the golden rule in which I pretty much read it within a day or two. I know that's not something you recommend, so I think that might be something worth prefacing this podcast with, really, because you recommend it in the book. Um, you talk about not really just jumping in and taking everything at once. You also recommend not making an over sort of laborious effort to retain all the information and put it into practice. And I guess the same could be said for listening to this podcast now with the information we deliver. Instead, you suggest that if something is worthwhile, if it resonates with someone, then it's just going to naturally linger throughout the course of their day. That's not something you typically see authors suggest. A lot of authors out there would encourage people to follow their book almost word for word or make notes and really analyze the book. Why do you suggest this approach?
Well, thank you very much. And this is, I mean, I'm really glad that you like the book. I am not on any level trying to tell people really that they have to read one of the 28 short chapters per day for a month. That's the structure. I think it's a great idea if you want to do it. I also think that framework kind of helps, even if you don't actually follow it. I think it's a useful thing to get your head around it, because the subject matter, I guess, is sort of action. It's like going from all these ideas about how it would be nice to change our lives and habits that would be useful to have, to like actually crossing that knowing to doing gap and embodying these things and doing the things that we care about in our lives now instead of at some point in the future. So one of the things you've really got to be wary of if you're going to write a book on this is that the book doesn't just fall victim to that same thing, right? And I think I certainly know from my own personal experience as a reader, if I come across some thrilling new productivity system or something, there's a strong urge to like take detailed notes, really try to get a handle on the whole thing, and then at some point implement it. Maybe in a few weeks, once I'm no longer overwhelmed by all these annoying to-dos I've got on my list, and or when I really understand it fully, then I'll get it right the first time or something. And so one of the things I'm trying to do sort of on every day of these 28 days beneath the sort of overt theme is like undermine that and be like, no, just like do a thing now. Like try this in your life today. Don't wait to get a grasp of it all. Also, yeah, don't try and force things that just don't resonate with you. I think, if something sort of connects with you because it's the right time in your life for you to hear that piece of advice, you should develop the self-trust that you're not going to forget it, right? It's not going to go away. And meanwhile, if what you do is you sort of write out a whole program about how you're going to do these 5 habits every day for the next month or something, it'll just recapitulate the same whole sort of internal conflict where you're like yelling at yourself for not doing enough. So I guess in lots of different ways, but that you're mentioning one of them, I wanted to try to make this book that's about action, sort of embody what it's meant to be. Like, I hope it will actually be a kind of action-inducing intervention, as opposed to a theoretical book about action, right? Which would be hypocritical, apart from anything else.
Well, I think the book really stands out and comes at a really pivotal time. The modern sort of productivity space is full of, it's fueled by hustle culture and jam packing your schedule and making every second of the day count. There's one video I joke about quite often where Gary V was given a talk on productivity, and he said that in all seriousness, he said, I don't even have time to chew. I don't even chew my food. I just swallow it. So when you look at the sort of modern productivity hustle culture space, what are some of the dangers and some of the pitfalls that people may fall into that you think aren't necessarily worthwhile exploring?
Well, I will say that I always think there's a certain kind of performance art to what Gary Vee's doing that I find difficult to hate, because it's like, it's so wild. Like, if that's your personality, live your best life. I don't want to get in the way. I think what there are other kinds of people in the world, though, who are not necessarily well advised to follow that. And I think one of the things, this sort of builds on stuff that I wrote about in my book 4,000 Weeks, is that one of the things is that optimization and becoming more efficient, trying to fit more in and always improve the level at which you're doing things, has a lot of built-in traps, right? If all you try to do when you're overwhelmed is fit more in, you actually end up busier and busier. If all you try to do when it comes to, I don't know, fitness goals or any other goal in life is like always be raising the bar on yourself, it turns into a struggle that can actually induce more procrastination. And just, I guess, the sort of umbrella idea is that we're incredibly tempted. The result of a lot of this advice is to set up this notion that at some point in the future, we're going to like get our lives sorted out. Our lives are going to be in working order, or we're finally going to understand how to do our jobs or be in a relationship or be a parent or whatever it is. Or that for other people, it's like, well, I'm just going to wait till the world political situation has calmed down, right? And like my argument is none of these things are ever going to happen. And that's actually very liberating and empowering, because if getting on top of everything or really figuring everything out about life is very difficult, then it's a lot of hard work. It's a big challenge. You feel like you haven't got there yet. But if it's not very difficult, but in fact impossible, that's actually great news, because then you can sort of let go of that kind of futile struggle to totally dominate reality before you do interesting stuff. And you can just start doing the interesting stuff. So just to give one example of this that I think is relevant, there is a tendency, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the idea of acquiring good habits. That's great, of course. But there is a tendency that people fall into, I think, where they decide they're going to be different from now on. They decide that they're going to meditate for 20 minutes every single day for the rest of their lives, or they're going to follow complicated morning routine every single day. And for lots of different reasons, but one could just be how much of a big task that starts to feel like. The result of trying to put this whole new system of being into place is that they're less likely to just actually once sit down and meditate for 20 minutes, or just actually once get up early. And so one of the other themes that I'm sort of harping on in this book is the great benefit of being able to let yourself just do a little bit of something that matters to you now, not as part of a big plan or big system. They have their place. I'm not against goal setting, but, just like put aside becoming a meditator. Just do it for 10 minutes today, actually, for real, because that has a value that all this hypothetical stuff can never have, because it's not real.
I think that's really really practical advice, one that I echo. There's a part in the book I found quite compelling, when you were talking about when you were writing at The Guardian, and you almost had this job of having to become an expert in a subject in a single day. I relate to that. It's something I've joked about quite often when I have a podcast with a guest on a subject I know nothing about. I always jokingly say to my friend, I have 2 days to become an expert in astrophysics, or acting, or something like that.
Right.
So, and in my scenario, the role of your boss is probably played by my subconscious, where I'm sort of pacing back and forth my own desk, right, demanding me to hit the word count quicker. If you were to look back on that time in your life, how would that version of Oliver Burkeman have benefited from imperfectionism?
I'm really glad that I had that training, and the editor who I anonymously tease in the book for hurrying me, Ian Katz, was an extraordinarily important formative influence on my writing, and I'm totally grateful. The problem with that world of like racing to become an expert, or to convince people that you're an expert, for 24 hours before moving on to the next thing, is not really that there's anything wrong with a high pressure, deadline driven environment. It's that my personality, anyway, and I think a lot of people's personalities, used that, I guess, to really reinforce and supercharge this sense of like, eventually I'd figure out how to do this, and soon I'd really have some time to focus on the things that I cared about, but I just had to get this one out of the way. Or if only I could find a way of working like 1.5 times as fast as currently, then I would never have this feeling of like being on the back foot and the deadlines here and what have I done. So it really fueled this notion of not quite having life nailed yet. And I think how 20 something Oliver at The Guardian could have benefited from that would have been just some of the felt understanding that actually, you know, nobody ever feels like they've got everything under control. There are systematic reasons why that's not going to happen. Systematic in the environment of a newspaper, but also just in human life and psychology. And so actually, you know, I could have done all those fast turnaround features and enjoyed myself instead of, and possibly even done them better as a result of enjoying myself. I could have, you know, when the day was over and it was the weekend, I could have not felt like, oh no, I've got to cram in this new thing in the weekend, otherwise I'm not going to stay on top of everything. And you know, it wouldn't necessarily have looked very different from the outside, but it would have been a much less sort of anxiety-ridden experience.
There's one idea you touch on early on in the book, and I probably get the pronunciation wrong, from a writer called Sasha Chapin. What's the pronunciation?
I think Chapin. Is it? Yeah, I think so.
And this idea of playing in the ruins, where he doesn't become the sort of idolized version of himself that, you know, the writer he always wanted to be or always looked up to being. And when he realizes that isn't going to happen, it's quite a liberating moment, and he's able to become the writer that he actually could have been, not the one he was, you know, always aiming for. And I think that's a really important idea. And a lot of people in the traditional self-help space or hustle culture, as we've touched on, might view that as quite a defeatist mindset. Why shouldn't we view it in that way?
I mean, just to sort of unpack it a little bit more, and then I will say why I think it becomes clear then in some ways why it's not defeatist. He's talking about, you know, for him, it was the worst thing that could happen. Like in his 20s, the worst thing that could happen would be that 10 years later than that, he'd realized that he was never going to be David Foster Wallace, right? That's the author that he sort of mentions as being a very deep admirer of. And the problem with that, of course, is that while you still think that any particular sort of utopian ideal might come around, you're not giving your full soul and attention and energy to your real life and to what you can do creatively. You're targeting this very specific goal, which is kind of someone else's goal anyway, right? Because it was for David Foster Wallace to be David Foster Wallace, and God knows he had a troubled life. So it's not really the gift that you've got to give. It's your way of characterizing it in somebody else's terms, and it's impossible, right? In some sense, it's not possible for any of us. It's not just, I'm not claiming that he was a less talented writer. He's a very talented writer. It's just that this external image of like being like someone else is not, you can never be, you know, Saul Bellow or Charles Dickens, or, you know, these people are themselves. So it's the defeat that is so powerful, and it's a really, and it's a kind of an empowering defeat. This is something that I've noticed runs through my writing, almost not deliberately, but there are all sorts of contexts where admitting defeat is actually a source of power and focus and accomplishment. And in this case, he means, you know, once you're no longer telling yourself all sorts of stories about what your creativity has got to look like one day in the future, then you can just play, right? Then you can just do the stuff on the page that like excites you and brings you alive. And that's when you do the things that are original and unique and also can have commercial success and also all the rest of it. So you're sort of, there are often these situations where we have some kind of goal that is in some sense impossible, becoming exactly the same as another famous writer, getting on top of every single email and demand that we could possibly get sent that could possibly come our way. I could mention 20 more. And there's just a real liberation in accepting that that's impossible. And the result is not that you then sit on your couch feeling depressed and not creating anything. The result is it's like, oh, I don't have to do that. Now I'm free to do this. And that kind of transformation has meant a great deal in my life too, because you unleash energy and power and attention when you're not using it on this quest to sort of overcome the human condition, which you're never going to succeed in.
Is there a particular point in maybe your career you can point to where you had that really liberating feeling and found yourself playing in the ruins?
I think for me, it has happened in sort of successive waves. And back in 4,000 Weeks, I wrote about a moment on a park bench in Brooklyn where we lived, and where I'd sort of it was an incredibly stressful week. I had so much I had to try to get through by the end of the week, and I was trying to think of what kind of productivity scheme I could introduce to force my way through to the end. And I was just struck by the thought that, oh, this is impossible. I can't do it. And that was so liberating, because then it was like, okay, now what are the most important things to actually do this week in the time that you do have? So that was a moment for that. I think, there was a sort of another phase of that in writing this book, with Meditations for Mortals, because can't really tell this story without sounding boastful, but 4,000 Weeks did much better than I was expecting. It's like a real sort of amazing to me how it had resonated with people. And then totally predictably, that sort of makes you freeze, and you think, oh my God, like everyone's going to be watching, like there's lots of people now who are going to think that I've got, and that classic thing where if you meet a certain bar, that just becomes a new bar that you've got to meet again and again and again. So a success becomes a punishment, which is totally ridiculous and screwed up, but so it goes. And I have to tell this anecdote carefully, I think, because I don't want to make anyone think that the resulting book is bad. I think the resulting book is really good. But I had to go through a phase of being like, I'm just going to write anything. Like, I'm going to have to be okay with this being like utterly bizarre and eccentric and weird and bad and people disliking it, because otherwise I'm never going to get anywhere. And I discovered some new ways of doing free writing where, you just sort of write unlimitedly into a file and with a timer running. And I did all sorts of other things that were all sort of had in common this notion that I was going to sort of leave standards at the door and just play in the ruins. And it, I think it's for the reader's judge, but I think it worked. I think it was the beginning of building up a book that then obviously, took a lot of work and a lot of editing. And as you can tell, I'm at pains to tell you that it wasn't just what I wrote into a file in 20 minutes without any plan or standard. But that's how it started. And it had to, I think, to get over that sort of perfectionistic barrier.
Amazing. One thing you briefly touched on a little earlier on is just doing things. Now, on the subject of doing things that matter, we've talked about this idea of just doing them. It can just be that simple. There doesn't necessarily have to be these tricks and productivity hacks, which are really popular online. It really reminds me of an idea that the great writer Stephen Pressfield was talking to me about. And it's this idea of, he calls it, put your ass where your heart wants to be. If you want to be a writer, just go and sit in front of a keyboard. If you want to, be a musician, then just sit down at the piano. It can be that simple, but it's simple, but it's so hard for people to do. They will look for the hacks. They will look for the long way round. If things really do matter, and if these things really do matter to us, why should this be such a hard thing to do?
I think it's because it feels like the stakes are so high. And, it doesn't, if you're wanting to write and you're not writing, it doesn't actually feel like the stakes are high in, moving your body over to a desk and sitting down on a chair. We all know the stakes aren't high there. But we know that the reason we're doing this is to try to get into the place where we're writing and doing the writing, and there the stakes feel really high. I think it, for a lot of people, including me in years gone by, and to some extent still today, it's because our sort of basic adequacy as human beings feels like it's at stake. It's like, if you screw this up, then you're kind of a worm. Or maybe it's your income, if you, which it is in my case, if you screw this up completely, like, you've got a problem because you earn your living by it. And so much sort of hangs on it that it's very hard to just sit down and do it. And it's also very hard to trick yourself with, like, ways of just opening the file or whatever, because in the back of your mind it's not about opening the file. In the back of your mind you want to do the whole thing. And I think that the only real way to deal with this in the long term is to experience as fully as you can, let yourself experience that sort of discomfort, right? So it's sitting down and writing a paragraph and just being ready for the absolute sort of all the internal voices telling you it's rubbish, and all the sense that this isn't the real thing, you should have found a better way to do it so that it was coming out perfectly. And sort of almost a kind of exposure therapy to that discomfort, and seeing that it doesn't actually destroy you, that there isn't this catastrophe that comes where you're sort of deemed by the gods to be worthless. There's a quotation attributed to the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. It's a little bit of a paraphrase, actually, but where he says that the catastrophe you fear will happen has already happened. And this is an amazing idea that I think you could sort of think about for hours. But one way of interpreting that to me is that, if you're terrified that what you put down on the page, or what happens when you make the sales call or whatever it is going to make you feel like totally useless, that's because at some point in your past, in the culture or your parents or whatever, you were made to feel kind of useless for not achieving things, that your worth as a person was dependent on what you managed to accomplish. But the great sort of hidden good news here is, like, you did survive, because here you are, right? So it clearly wasn't the case that failing something in the past or not measuring up was as catastrophic as you thought it would be. And so, you just sort of push yourself very gently and with a friendly spirit into the next 10 minutes of, like, putting some bad words on the page, a shitty first draft in Anne Lamott's famous terminology, and crucially, you don't expect that within about 20 minutes it's going to feel absolutely great and you're over the hump. It's like, no, that's sort of what it is. That's what it is to be limited and to be sort of fearful and anxious, and that's fine. Just, you can keep going anyway.
One productivity tool that is seemingly as old as time is the to-do list. I've seen millions of variations of something that should be quite a straightforward tool. In this book, you suggest the possibility of a done list. Now, this is something I've actually tried in the past, but I remember the first time, probably 5 or so years ago, I tried to do something like this. My fears were that it would lead to a loss of productivity. It would maybe allow me to set a lower standard for myself. Right. It maybe I would hold me back from hitting my potential. And if I had one thing I really wanted to do, let's say I wanted to do some research for a book I wanted to write, and I didn't get around to that I could almost justify not doing it by saying, well, look, I edited a podcast today, I wrote a newsletter today. How do we use the done list, but in a way that doesn't limit us from doing the hard things, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting angle you raise, the idea that you sort of, the other things you did do substitute for the thing you really wanted to do. Part of this is contextual, right? It might be that the best time to use a done list is when you're feeling just totally overwhelmed by all the things it feels like you've got to do, because a regular approach to doing things in that context sort of naturally invites you to compare what you're doing with all the stuff that is left to do, which is basically infinite. So you're never going to come out good from that comparison. You're always going to be found wanting. Whereas a done list sort of looks back and says, well, look, compared to what if I'd done nothing today, these are the things that I've done. But I also think you can take an attitude to that where, it almost becomes, there's something very special, almost kind of sacred in a way, maybe, about sort of taking a thing, doing it, and putting it on the done list. It's like you're curating this list of things that were actually what you did to engage with the world today. And done in that spirit, I think you might want to be very sure that you did move across the thing that mattered to you, the research of the chapter for the book, right? Because it's not just scribbling words on a page to make yourself feel better about a long list. That could probably work for a day or two to get yourself out of a motivational rut, but you're going to see through it pretty quickly. I think that notion of it really draws your attention to the fact that we've got a finite capacity, that, depending on how large you define, how the size of projects and tasks that you define, you're probably going to be able to do, 10 things, maybe 30 things in a day, depending on how you slice them up, not thousands. And so then it becomes quite an interesting special question, like which 30 is it going to be? And there's a sort of care in that, which I think is quite appealing way to work, right? It's like, there will only be a small batch today. So what would be nice to see on that batch at the end of the day?
One phrase I've probably used too often in my life, probably much to my detriment because I used it in the wrong context, was we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Or my version of that, when I was a younger man in my university days, when I would leave my assignments very late and my friends would say, that's if you start tomorrow, then it's going to be really close to the deadline. And I'd always say, well, that's future Lewis's problem. That was my sort of university catchphrase that probably put myself under more pressure than was needed. But in terms of crossing the bridge when we get to it, when we're coming from the perspective of worrying about things that we don't have to worry about yet, I think everyone agrees that makes sense, rational sense. But how do we get past that, churning in the back of your mind, that sort of impending doom, all playing over all the possibilities? This is something I'm not very good with. I'll always be thinking about, what could go wrong? This scenario could happen, that scenario could happen. How do we move past that effectively then?
Yeah, well, this how question is, I think, really goes to the heart of lots of different things I'm trying to do in this book, because I think the answer and I will talk about the specific one, but I think the answer to a lot of these how questions, which might seem to invite an answer like, well, here's this technique that you should implement, which is almost always change your perspective and see the truth about things different and see the world in a different way. And then people are like, well, yeah, okay, but how do I do that? And how do I make that stick? And so what I'm really trying to do in this book is take these perspective shifts and really provide a container in the context, in the form of the book, for this to sort of seep into your life. So, the actual answer I want to give self-promotingly is like, read the chapter on this in my book and let it simmer in your mind as you go through the day, and maybe try to live from that perspective shift a little bit. So what is that perspective shift? I mean, I think the perspective shift in the case of crossing bridges when we come to them is understanding that, deeply understanding that is the only time when you can cross a bridge. It isn't about saying, well, some people do a lot of planning and they're sensible and some people don't and they are irresponsible. It's like, sure, a little bit of planning in certain contexts makes sense. Of course, if you're going on a trip, you plan the times of the train or the plane you want to take and all that stuff. But trying to think your way through all the eventualities that could happen and then get to that sense of security that it's all prepared and all thought through, it can never work, right? Because you can't think of all the eventualities that might happen. And you certainly can't convince yourself that everything went fine with those eventualities because it hasn't happened yet. So there's a real sort of important shift where you understand that the future belongs to the future. And when you're at university, it was actually not the case that you had to leave all that preparation the next day, right? You could have put in a couple of hours on this day, and that would have been a useful way of using the present moment. But had you been doing more diligent work as you should have been doing, it would still have been something to leave to the future about whether you were going to get a good grade for that essay, right? That is something that you can't think your way through and achieve certainty about in advance. So, I'm talking over and over again in this book about different ways in which we're really more limited than we think, and how it's empowering to sort of step into that. And one of the ways we're limited is that we're limited to the present. We can't know how things will go in the future. In theory, anything could happen within the laws of physics, right? So you could walk out of the building and a grand piano could drop on your head from a higher floor. It's very unlikely, but you actually can't rule it out. So if you're going to approach life in this kind of like, I want to pin down all the possibilities and get them pinned down, that you'll just fret and worry all the time. And I think that, the way you live into this different way of doing things is bit by bit. You maybe don't check whether your train is on time every 5 minutes on the way to the station. And then maybe later, when you get more practiced at this, you can be a bit more relaxed about some bigger deal things. And that is, again, don't want to keep you on about the book, but that is part of the idea of like little bits every day. It's like, that is how we change. I think we put a little feeler out. We find that the world doesn't blow up when we act that way. And then we're empowered to go a little bit further the next day.
So on that same thread then of not, being too focused on the future, one thing I've always been terrible for is, especially a couple of years ago, is waiting for the next problem. Sometimes it can feel like life's playing a cruel joke on you, right? You feel like as soon as you get on top of one thing, you almost can't let yourself settle because you're just thinking, what's next? And this is something I was terrible for when I moved into my first house, actually. There were a couple of like immediate problems that just came out of nowhere with the house. And one after another, they seemed to fall. And, as soon as I solved one, people would say to me, oh, you must feel relieved, right? And I'd say, well, not really, because I know I've done that one now, so I'm waiting for the next one, which is inevitably coming. And I got myself into this horrible headspace of never really being able to enjoy the moment, enjoy the process, because I was always waiting for what's next. What advice would you give to those people that are seemingly always in that state of worry of the next problem that's coming, and sort of view life as a series of tackling problems?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And there is a little bit in this book, partly inspired by something, as I say in the book, that I heard Sam Harris say, that actually a big part of what underlies that stressful situation that you write about, that you mentioned, so you talked about, sorry, is there's like an agenda there that we shouldn't have problems, that we should at some point be able to get all these problems out of the way and just relax, be in the problem-free phase of life. And Sam Harris writes very amusingly about how he was sort of moaning on to a friend about all the problems in his work, and she interrupted him and said, like, hold on, are you still under the impression you're going to get to the stage of your life where you don't have problems? And I think there's something really deep in this. Obviously, very big and scary problems. You would hope to not have many of them in your life, and you can get past them, one hopes, and then that's great. But the sheer fact of having problems, that just sort of is another word for life, right? Because it's just the fact that there are things that you need to address yourself to if you want to achieve your goals or live your values or whatever it is. That's what all a problem is at the most basic level. And so, another friend of mine had this realization in her job where she was feeling that all these problems that she was having to deal with were getting in the way of her really doing the job, and it struck her that actually no, the problems were the job, right? That the reason she was employed, the expertise she had, was the thing that couldn't be outsourced to a computer or turned into a simple, repeatable set of steps that somebody less qualified could maybe handle on her behalf. No, the job that you have is solving the problems. And, you know, and as a writer as well, it's like you struggle and puzzle about how to structure something or get over some problem you're encountering in how to make something work in a book. It's so easy to think of like, oh God, I can't wait till the day when I know how to do this and these things don't arise. But they won't. And if it is possible to not struggle with those problems entirely, then artificial intelligence is just going to write all those books, which may happen anyway. A separate conversation. So it's like, no, the thing I bring to the party, the thing each of us brings to the party as a human is grappling with problems. And then you can just sort of relax into it and be like, okay, this is what my life is going to be. A lot of great problems to solve until it's all over.
Another part of the book I found compelling, and I have to quote you. You say, ask people to relate to milestones in their biography, and they'll almost always dwell on moments whose consequences they could never have anticipated. This is so true. You know, if you speak to a friend and they say, I've got a great story to tell you, it often begins with, well, I can laugh about it now, but, you know, they never tell you about a moment that, hey, I went to this place. Things were just as great as I expected. We all had a great time. Those are never the stories that people relate to. Why is it hardwired in us then to fixate on these moments?
I mean, I'm not sure whether I would agree that we fixate on them. I think that but hopefully I'll get into your question from a slight angle. I mean, I think the really that section you're referring to in the book is got this. The headline is, the title is a good time or a good story, right? This old saying that like almost everything that happens is either a good time or a good story. Either it goes well and everything's happy, or it goes badly and like you get to tell your friends for years afterwards about what a disaster it was. Now there is a third category of real tragedies that happen to people, absolutely 100%. But it's amazing how often something that feels like it's a huge mess and going very badly when it happens turns out to be a good story. Then, of course, you mentioned like when you look back at your own life, there are all these critical moments where you sort of meet someone at a gathering where you hadn't been expected to meet them, or you send an email to someone that you weren't expecting to lead to much, but it leads to something huge. And that is a different kind of uncontrollability. And I think what unites it all, and the reason that we find them so interesting, to answer your question, is that we go through life feeling like we want to get more and more control, and that the more control we had over things, the better life would be. And yet we are haunted all the time on some subconscious maybe level by the knowledge that all these great things that make up our life were only happened because we don't have complete control. And you can see this in lots of other areas, right? I mean, like the reason that a football match is compelling is because you don't know who will win. The reason that it's interesting to study something in university, if it is because you haven't explored every byway of this topic and got it all nailed. So this lack of control and lack of certainty gives a lot of these experiences their value. And yet, if you fall into that mindset of like, I'm going to optimize my life, I'm going to plan my day, I'm going to have all my goals set up and approach them. If you go too far into that, you're really doubling down on control and therefore sort of squeezing out the potential for these things that really that really end up making a difference. So I think there's something about us that wants control, but there's something else about us that knows that a lot of the things we value in life come from our control not being total.
One of the sections of this book that really just jumped off the page and slapped me in the face was the importance of staying distractible. Now, you hear that and you think this goes against a lot of traditional self-help, a lot of, again, we've touched on it, hustle culture. And there's so many books written about the very opposite thing. There's books focused on how to be indistractable. There are books focused on, why we're becoming more distractible. And these are massive best-selling books on this. And people love this idea of becoming indistractable. Why do you talk about the importance of staying distractible?
I just want to say first that I count Nir Eyal as a friend, and I think it would be absolutely great to have some kind of like overly fighty kind of, WWE themed kind of debate about this
Well, New's
in
been on
public
the show
sometime. I
many
feel like
years ago, so I'd love to host that debate.
I think we could do it in a good spirit, but and he's not wrong, but I think I'm also right. Um, and I what I'm talking about there is, I mean, there's lots of different avenues to go down here, but I think just a simple one is that too much effort applied to um, sort of having your day go in the way you want it to go, setting these kind of hard boundaries, whether that's, all sorts of ways of doing this, to make sure that serendipitous things can't happen is can be really antithetical to the kind of lives we want to live. So the example that I give in the book is, if it's 4 p.m. on a weekday and it's not my turn for school pickup and I'm working in my home office and our 7-year-old son bursts into the room and tells me something exciting about what he's done at school that day, like, that's great. That's one of the things that life is supposed to be about. And I am totally keen to have that connection with him. But if I had sort of time boxed my day to within an inch of its life and 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. was deep, hard focus monk mode, then suddenly him coming in is like a problem. That something's gone wrong. And my incentive is to like sort of stop it as fast as possible and be like, no, leave me alone. There obviously is a balance to be struck here, because you don't want to be totally distractible like by random social media nonsense all day long. But there is this understanding that we need, I think, that because of the very fact that you can't know what is going to be beneficial in life, what is going to be interesting, what is going to be a high quality experience, you can't actually determine in advance like what are the interruptions and what are the really important things. And as the Zen writer John Tarrant also says, and I quote him in the book, it's also just not actually the real nature of the human mind to be sort of rigidly focused on one thing. There's a sort of gentle moving between things, a sort of gentle distractibility that is actually very natural and a very pleasant thing to cultivate, and that you can absolutely then use to gently put your attention onto the thing you want to work on. And then maybe if someone comes into the room, you can give them your attention for a moment and look them in the eye and then say, okay, I'm going to finish this thing first and I'll be with you soon. And the funny thing is that actually, when you look at what's really bad, in my opinion, about social media distraction, for example, it's actually not that it breaks our distraction, it's that it holds our distraction, our attention. It's not that it breaks our attention, but it holds our attention, right? It takes you from the thing you were doing, and then you're just like staring in horror for half an hour at the nonsense that people are coming up with about American politics or something, right? So cultivating, being willing to let your attention move from one thing to another is going to help you then bring it back again. And I just think there's a way of doing this. There's an approach to take to distraction that doesn't involve these kind of rigid plans to shut everything out, but perhaps could involve a different plan, like saying, over the course of today, I want to give like 3 hours of good focus to this creative project that is important to me. And with that in the back of my mind, I will probably, gently rebuff certain distractions and stay away from social media, but I won't be fighting for this rigid box of focus.
One of my favorite walk that myself and my co-host Joseph, we've gone on ever since we were kids. We go to this mountain that's near us here in the South Wales valleys, and on top of this mountain, you pretty much get like a 360 view of the surrounding areas, especially in the valleys. You can see all the way into Cardiff. You can pretty much see the entire Cardiff landscape. If you look that way, if you turn that way, you can see the valleys. It's a really crazy 360 view. It's a beautiful thing. But the last time we were up there, Joe said to me, this, I feel so used to this because it's on our doorstep, that I feel like if we traveled to the Netherlands and we had this exact view, that we'd be up here staring at it for hours and we wouldn't be able to believe it. Is that then a good indicator that when things are finite, when we know they're not on our doorstep, when we know that we're probably not going to experience this again, that we should start viewing that as a good thing, and we should start to embrace the idea of something not always being there, and this being one moment in time rather than something we can revisit. A lot of people get sad about that. Should we embrace that?
Well, I think the answer is both, right? I think we should embrace it because it's reality and there's a value in that, and the sort of finitude of experiences is what gives them their value, but it's also sad. So, the idea that you're going to always be able to look at that view is not true, because you're not going to be here forever. And sort of even more, to go even to drill down another level, like that specific moment is with your friend then is never going to happen again, even if many more moments with the same person happen again. So in a way, every moment, our finitude means that like every moment of experience is the last time we're having that moment of experience. And it is sad. And, there's definitely benefit in going to some other places as well, because then you really feel the transience and the fact that you've got to sort of make the most of this moment. But there's also something kind of, well, the word that I always come up with is poignant, because I think that's a word that sort of encompasses sadness, but it's not just bad, right? There's a concept in Japanese, which I think is pronounced mono no aware, but I'm probably getting it slightly wrong, which sort of really talks about the value of that sort of wistful sadness. Like it gives more richness to the experience to remember when you're standing on a hillside or meeting up with someone who you love but who lives a long way away, that you only get a handful of these things. It is sad. It would be nice if they went on forever, we think. Actually, I think it would be terrible. It's a separate conversation. But that's a kind of enriching sadness that makes it sort of sweet in a way. And so I just think it's really useful to remember when you're doing something enjoyable, that like it could be the last time you do that thing. It's definitely the last time you have that moment. And like how amazing to get to have it. Not just like how annoying that there aren't going to be an infinite number of other moments in the future.
As we start to round out this conversation now, there's one more thing I want to touch on, and I've tried to write why this is such a powerful thing for me. I've never really been able to put it into words. I've tried writing several newsletters on the subject, but it's this idea of a cosmic perspective, and why it's been important for me. So I've always had quite bad anxiety, especially when I was younger. And one of my first ever jobs was I was a gym instructor. And I remember my first week on the job, I was told I had to teach this circuit training class. I'd never taught a class before, really didn't like getting up in front of people. And it felt like the most sort of petrifying moment possible. I thought nothing is scarier than this right now. And I remember about 20 minutes before the class, I was in the sort of staff changing room and I pulled up this video on my phone. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but it was one of those videos where on YouTube, and I've linked this in newsletters in the past, is a very specific one. It starts off on a house and then the video just slowly goes out and out into the universe and beyond. And I remember thinking, well, and this isn't to say that your feelings aren't valid, but it really put into my perspective in the bigger picture, and it made me realize that, wow, if I'm just this tiny little piece in this grand bigger picture, then I'm pretty sure I can go and teach a local spin class, right? That seems like quite an easy thing to do now. And an idea that an astrophysicist, Dr. Stuart Clark, told me about was going outside and looking at the night sky and looking at constellations, and these constellations being the same constellations that many great people throughout history would have looked at, and this idea that you're there and you're essentially sharing an experience with William Shakespeare or all these other amazing names you can think of. You all had that experience of looking at the same constellation, the same sort of night sky, and it really helps me frame where I am in the bigger picture. Is this something that you can relate to and that you find powerful, this idea of cosmic perspective? I know that the Stoics, I know Marcus Aurelius wrote about this as well.
Yeah. No, it is, and I loved your description of it there, and um, it's it's really powerful. I think it can be misinterpreted. I don't think you've misinterpreted it, but I think some people can, as sort of saying like nothing you do matters. But it's that sense of feeling yourself a part of something much, much, much bigger that has been fine without you and will be fine without you in the future. And you're making a contribution, and you're not making no contribution, right? Teaching the class you were teaching is a contribution and made a real difference to some people. At the same time, it's not essential in the sense that like the world's going to end if you don't do it. And that's kind of a lovely place to be, because you get to sort of give something, but you don't have to panic that it's that everything is riding on it. And so yeah, this idea that I've in the past called cosmic insignificance therapy, where you sort of can bring things down, cut your worries down to size by thinking about and really feeling, how that goes. And also worries about, like, if you're the kind of person who reads the news and worries about things you read in the news, like just the sense that like there are huge rocks on the coast of, I don't know, South America, where the sea lashes around them, that have been there for like millions of, or certainly hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, and will be there for many, many more. And so many sort of wars and national dramas and international dramas have come and fallen, and they sort of continue. Again, it's not total solace if you're going to sort of, there's going to be a huge nuclear conflagration or something, but it puts things into, it brings things down to size. And yeah, I think specifically it gives that sense that you're just one part of the world making a contribution to it. You're doing your little bit now, and that is important, but it's also little.
Amazing. Well, this conversation today has, of course, been around the book Meditations for Mortals. Before we let everyone know where they can check the book out and connect with you and further work from yourself, the question that we ask every guest that comes on this show, doesn't matter what the topic is, it could be a biologist, it could be an actor, it could be anyone. I ask the same question, and the answer can be anything, just what it means to you. Right now, for Oliver Burkeman, what makes life worth living?
The answer that I'm going to give, because it's the truest one, is the feeling of aliveness. And then I'm going to say something because I think that's sort of an annoying answer, right? What you maybe want, and this is equally true, is, spending time with my son, getting to write about ideas that interest me, being out in the North York moors where we live, in those vast landscapes. But the thing that they all have in common, really, and that some other surprising things have in common, sometimes when you're least expecting it, is this real sense of fully being here for this. Good bits, bad bits, but like not the meaning of life, but just a feeling of aliveness. And it doesn't really make any sense, because obviously you're alive when everything's happening, including all the boring bits and the bits that you don't feel focused on. But that word aliveness, I've never found anything better than, and it seems to me that a lot of people do know what I'm talking about, even though it doesn't quite make sense in a straightforward way.
Well, I'm going to, of course, leave all the links in the description below. And now I'm not just saying this because you're sat in front of me. I texted this to my co-host the other day, and no disrespect to any of the great authors I've had on the show this year, but I texted my co-host the other day, and I told him after I read this book, this was my book of the year so far.
Wow.
And I really do mean that. I think it's an absolutely phenomenal book. I'm a big fan of your writing style, and it's had a major impact on me, and I was really thinking about it the next day and the day after. So for everyone listening and watching this right now who may want to check the book out for themselves or connect with you online and check out some of your other work, where's the best place they can go to right now?
Well, in all honesty, the best place to go would be to order, or I'm not exactly sure when this comes out, to pre-order the book wherever you get your books, in any format. Audiobooks are fine, or ebooks, they all count. That makes a huge difference to authors. My website is oliverburkeman.com. I'm on Twitter or X, Oliver Burkeman, although I sometimes think I probably shouldn't be. So there's plenty more there. You can sign up for my email newsletter. But really, at the risk of sounding like I'm making desperate pleas, you know, pre-ordering books makes an amazing difference to authors. I'm not sure everyone realizes it, but it's like supercharges the sort of generosity of your decision to buy it if you do it in advance of the publication date.
Yes, I was having this conversation last night with another guest. One thing that all writers tell me on this show is the power of the pre-order.
Yeah,
It
it's
does
really
tend to.
true. Yeah, yeah. Because the bookstores watch it and the retailers see it, and it shows that something's moving, and then when you're lucky, a sort of a snowball effect can be triggered. But who knows?
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure the relevant links in the description below. I will also, I've said book of the year, but this book will be the book of the week in our weekly newsletter also, so people can check it out there. Oliver, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.